Why do we see faces in the clouds, signs in the chaos, and meanings where perhaps none exist? Why does a sequence of repeated numbers grab our attention so much, as if trying to tell us something? Why do certain coincidences seem too big to be just chance? If you've ever experienced this, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you more than you imagine. We've all experienced moments like this. You look at the clock and always see the same time. You hear a specific song and, soon after, something important happens. You notice stains on the wall, shapes in the sky, or random noises, and suddenly you see a clear, almost obvious pattern. It doesn't seem random. On the contrary, it seems full of meaning. And the more you pay attention, the more these patterns seem to repeat themselves, as if the world were trying to communicate directly with you. But what if the problem isn't in the world, but in the brain? The human brain is extraordinary, but it has a curious characteristic. It doesn't deal well with chance. The idea that events can simply happen without reason, without intention, and without meaning is deeply uncomfortable for the mind. From a very early age, the brain learns to organize chaos, to seek logic where everything seems confusing, to connect the dots even when those dots may have no real relation to each other. This has helped us survive, anticipate dangers, and make quick decisions. But this same mechanism can deceive us, and it does so more often than we imagine. When you believe you're seeing patterns in chance, it's not because you're naive, superstitious, or irrational. It's because your brain is extremely efficient at recognizing patterns, even when they don't exist. It's been wired to detect regularities, predict what comes next, and create narratives that make sense. In a world full of random stimuli, the brain prefers to create an imperfect explanation rather than accept the emptiness of uncertainty. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to believe that this wasn't a coincidence, than to admit that there's no explanation at all? What's most intriguing is that these patterns seem real. They don't arise as a vague doubt, but as a strong feeling of recognition, almost like a mental click. Something inside you says, this makes sense. And when something makes sense, the brain releases a feeling of relief, of understanding, of control. That's why seeing patterns in chance can be so convincing and even comforting. You feel like you understand the world better. But are you really? Perhaps, at this very moment, you are remembering situations from your own life where everything seemed to fit perfectly. Improbable coincidences, strange repetitions, signs that appeared at the right moment. If this has happened to you, you are not alone. This phenomenon is universal, crossing cultures, ages, and levels of education. It is part of how the human brain perceives reality. And the more emotionally involved you are, the stronger this perception becomes. What few people realize is that the brain isn't interested in absolute truth. It's interested in coherence, predictability, and security. When the world seems too chaotic, it kicks in to organize everything, even if, to do so, it needs to see patterns where there's only randomness. Stay with me until the end of this video because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you interpret coincidences, signs, and even the decisions you make every day. Now, before we delve any deeper, it's worth holding this question in the air. If so many of the patterns we see are creations of the brain, to what extent does what we call meaning truly come from the world, and not from our minds desperately trying to organize it? And perhaps that's exactly why this topic resonates so much. As you listen to all this, it's hard not to recognize yourself in some specific situation. That moment when something seemed too clear to be a coincidence, or that strange feeling that your brain was connecting the dots before you even realized it. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you the most so far. Sometimes, putting it into words even helps to see these patterns more clearly, and reading about other people's experiences creates something powerful. The realization that no one experiences this alone. This space isn't just for passive watching. It exists to provoke reflection, exchange, and awareness. When you comment, you're not just reacting to a video, you're helping to build a conversation about how the human brain works, about how we all interpret reality in similar ways, even when we think we're alone in these experiences. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who may be experiencing the exact same doubts and feelings as you. And if, at any point in this video, something made you stop and think, this explains a lot, consider leaving a like. Not as an automatic gesture but as a sign that this type of content, deeper, more reflective, more human, deserves to continue existing. Each like tells the algorithm that it's worthwhile to take this conversation further, beyond those who are already here now. Similarly, if you're curious about these mysteries of the brain, about these strange phenomena that challenge our perception of what is real, subscribing to the channel is almost a silent invitation to continue this journey together. It's saying, I want to understand more, I want to question more, I want to look at my own mind with different eyes. And that makes all the difference in ensuring that this content continues to be produced, deepened, and shared. As you reflect on all of this, it's worth paying attention to something subtle. How many times, just by hearing these ideas, has your brain already started searching for examples, memories, and its own connections? It does this automatically all the time, even now. And that's exactly where the story starts to get even more interesting. Because, from here on, we're going to delve deeper into the mechanisms that make the brain perceive order where perhaps there is only chance. There is something that deeply disturbs the human brain: the possibility that things simply happen for no reason at all. Pure chance, without intention, without apparent logic, without a narrative behind it, sounds almost like a threat. The human mind was not designed to coexist peacefully with the idea of randomness. From the beginning of our evolutionary history, the brain developed to predict, organize, and find meaning, even when that meaning does not objectively exist. In unpredictable environments, those who survived were those who could quickly see patterns, who anticipated movements, who transformed confusing signals into some form of meaning, however imperfect. Therefore, the brain doesn't accept randomness well. When faced with chaos, it doesn't remain neutral. It reacts. It starts searching for connections, references, repetitions. Where there are isolated events, it creates a sequence. Where there is noise, it tries to extract information. All of this happens automatically, behind the scenes of the mind, without you needing to consciously decide to do it. The brain prefers a wrong explanation to the discomfort of having none. This phrase summarizes a hidden truth about how we perceive the world and how our relationship with reality is much more emotional than logical. The absence of explanation generates tension. When something happens without apparent cause, the brain goes into a state of alert. It revisits memories, compares past situations, cross-references experiences, and looks for familiar patterns. This process is not aimed at finding absolute truth, but at reducing the feeling of uncertainty. The simple fact that something makes sense internally is enough to alleviate discomfort. And that is precisely where the risk lies. Internal coherence can be confused with truth. This need to organize the world is not a systemic error. On the contrary, it was fundamental to our survival as a species. It was thanks to this ability to detect patterns that we developed language, culture, tools, strategies, and complex decisions. The problem arises when the same mechanism, so efficient at protecting us, begins to distort. In contexts of uncertainty, change, or emotional pressure, the brain intensifies this behavior. It begins to see meaning where perhaps there is only coincidence. Not out of naivete but out of self-preservation. Whenever the world seems too unstable, the brain tries to regain a sense of control. Crises, losses, important decisions, profound transformations. All these moments strongly activate the search for meaning. Creating a narrative, even a fragile one, is a quick way to reduce fear. If something happened for a reason, then there is order. If there is order, there is predictability. And if there is predictability, the brain can relax. In this process, truth becomes secondary. This is where many people confuse a feeling of understanding with real understanding. The brain produces a powerful emotional response when it believes it has found a pattern. It's almost an internal reward, a feeling of sudden clarity. This moment is so compelling that we rarely stop to question whether that connection is real or just comfortable. The mind doesn't ask if it's statistically valid or logically consistent. It asks if it reduces uncertainty. If it does, it accepts it. This mechanism directly influences our decisions. Many important choices are not made based on solid facts, but on internal narratives that seem coherent. Coincidences gain excessive weight. Repetitions become signs. Disconnected events begin to appear as part of a larger plan. All of this shapes mindset, directs behaviors, and creates certainties that, in practice, are based more on emotional need than on objective reality. Over time, this way of interpreting the world builds deep-seated beliefs. We come to trust our sense of meaning more than the verification of facts. What matches what we feel seems more true than what can be questioned. And this process doesn't only happen in extreme situations. It manifests itself in everyday life, in small interpretations, in quick readings of reality, in the stories we tell ourselves to give meaning to what we experience. The brain, at its core, isn't concerned with absolute truth. It's concerned with stability. It wants to reduce chaos, minimize risk, create a navigable version of the world. If that requires it to see patterns where there is only chance, it will do so without hesitation. Not because it's deceiving you, but because it's trying to protect you. This is one of the most important revelations when we talk about perception, decisions, and how we construct meaning throughout our journey. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain rejects chance takes us directly to the heart of how it creates patterns, how it transforms noise into meaning, and how it constructs such compelling internal narratives that they guide our choices, our certainties, and even how we interpret who we are. The more we observe this mechanism in action, the more we realize that the meaning we find in the world doesn't always stem from external reality, but from the mind's urgent need to organize chaos and move forward. Comment below, this makes sense to me. When we start observing more closely, it becomes clear that the brain not only rejects chance, it actively replaces it with something more comfortable. There is a silent mechanism operating all the time, far from our consciousness, that transforms scattered fragments into recognizable structures. The brain essentially functions as a pattern-detecting machine. It has been trained over thousands of years to do exactly that: find regularity where there seems to be disorder, identify signals before they become threats, anticipate what might happen next. This mechanism didn't arise by chance. In primitive environments, recognizing patterns was a matter of survival. A repeated noise in the forest could indicate a predator. A subtle change in the weather could mean imminent danger. Certain shapes, movements, or sounds needed to be interpreted quickly, even with little information available. There was no time for in-depth analysis or careful verification of the facts. Those who waited for absolute certainty did not survive. Those who erred on the side of caution did. In this context, seeing a non-existent pattern was less dangerous than ignoring a real one. That's why the brain prefers false positives to the risk of noticing anything. It was wired to make mistakes quickly and move on, not to be perfectly accurate. This evolutionary trait has profoundly shaped our mindset. To this day, the mind operates with this logic. It's better to assume there's a pattern than to accept the emptiness of uncertainty. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of human perception, and also one of the most deceptive. Pattern recognition happens even before conscious thought. You don't coldly analyze data and then decide that something makes sense. First comes the feeling of familiarity, of coherence, of fitting in. Only then does rational thought come into play, often just to justify what has already been decided internally. This process is so fast and so automatic that we rarely realize when we are being guided by it. The mind presents the final result as if it were obvious, natural, inevitable. This mechanism has been essential to our journey as a species, but it comes at a price. The same system that protects us also deceives us. By detecting patterns where none exist, the brain creates extremely convincing illusions of meaning. It connects isolated events, transforms coincidences into signals, and constructs narratives from loose fragments. And the more emotionally charged the context, the stronger this effect becomes. Emotion acts as an amplifier of pattern recognition. During times of personal transformation, major decisions, or emotional instability, the brain enters an intensified mode. It begins to seek meaning with even greater urgency. Small details gain exaggerated weight. Casual repetitions seem like messages. The mind begins to construct stories that explain what is happening, even if these stories lack objective support. The impact of this is profound because these internal narratives begin to guide behaviors, choices, and even how the person interprets their own trajectory. The curious thing is that, from an internal point of view, everything seems to make sense. There is coherence, continuity, emotional logic. The feeling is one of clarity, not confusion. That's why questioning these patterns can be uncomfortable. Questioning what makes sense internally seems almost like a threat to mental stability. The brain resists because abandoning a pattern means facing chaos again. And chaos, for the human mind, is always something to be avoided. This dynamic reveals something important about the hidden truth behind perception. The brain doesn't seek reality as it is, it seeks a functional version of reality. A version that allows one to move forward, make decisions, maintain some sense of control. If this version is distorted but emotionally effective, it still serves its purpose. Accuracy comes later, if it comes at all. Often it never does. Over time, this process shapes deep-seated beliefs. The person begins to trust what seems consistent more than what can be verified. The recognized pattern gains the status of truth. And as these patterns are reinforced internally, they become increasingly difficult to question. The mind enters a confirmation cycle, where everything that arises is interpreted in light of the pre-existing narrative. Pattern recognition, which began as protection, transforms into limitation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how the brain detects patterns leads us directly to understanding why we see order and chance, why certain illusions seem so real, and why some internal narratives become so powerful that they shape our worldview. When we begin to observe this mechanism in action, we realize that much of what we call meaning arises less from external reality and more from the internal need to organize, explain, and control experience. And it is precisely at this point that the most disconcerting revelations begin about how the mind constructs what we call reality. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. At a certain point in this silent journey that takes place within the mind, the brain crosses an almost imperceptible line. It stops merely recognizing real patterns and begins to see patterns that don't actually exist. And the most intriguing thing is that this doesn't sound like an error, a failure, or a mistake. Internally, the sensation is one of clarity. Everything seems to fit together. The pattern seems legitimate, logical, almost inevitable. It is precisely here that one of the most disconcerting revelations about human perception lies. The brain doesn't ask if it's true. It asks if it makes sense. When you observe visual noise, smudges, shadows, pixels, static, and suddenly see a clear figure, a face, a familiar symbol, it doesn't happen because you decided to imagine something. It happens because the brain hates gaps. It doesn't tolerate incomplete information well. Faced with fragmented data, it doesn't patiently wait for the image to reveal itself completely. It intervenes. It fills in. It completes. It adjusts. The brain functions as a real-time editor of reality, always trying to deliver a comprehensible version of what is being perceived. This same mechanism manifests itself outside the visual field, in an even deeper way in everyday life. Isolated events, when they occur close in time, rarely remain separate in the mind. The brain begins to connect them almost automatically. One event leads to another. One coincidence draws attention. Two coincidences already arouse suspicion. Three coincidences seem to demand an explanation. And the greater the emotional charge involved, the more urgent this search for meaning becomes. The mind cannot bear the idea that something important simply happened without reason. From there, internal narratives emerge. Stories that organize the chaos and create a sense of continuity. The brain constructs a plot with a beginning, middle, and intention, even when the facts are unrelated. This narrative doesn't arise as fiction. It emerges as a legitimate interpretation of reality. There's no internal warning saying, this is just a hypothesis. The brain presents the final result as if it were a direct reading of the world. And that is extremely convincing. This internal coherence generates relief. It gives the feeling that everything is under control. That there is a hidden logic operating behind the scenes of the experience. The emotional impact of this is powerful. When something makes sense, discomfort diminishes. Anxiety decreases. The mind relaxes. And at that point, verifying the truth ceases to be a priority. The brain has already fulfilled its main function, to make reality bearable. This process profoundly influences how we make decisions. Important choices become guided by connections that seem solid, but may simply be well-aligned coincidences. The mind confuses correlation with causation, sequence with intention, repetition with signal. Gradually, these interpretations gain strength. They are repeated internally, reinforced emotionally, and incorporated into the person's mindset. The pattern ceases to be just one possible interpretation and becomes treated as a hidden truth. There is also a silent effect on memory. The past does not remain intact. It is rearranged to fit the current narrative. Old events gain new meanings. Forgotten coincidences reappear with a different weight. Memories are adjusted to maintain the coherence of the story the brain has decided to tell. This process happens behind the scenes without conscious effort. Memory molds itself to protect the newly created meaning. This ability to create meaning where perhaps none exists is a central part of the human experience. It drives transformation, helps us get through difficult times, and gives direction to our personal journey. At the same time, it can be limiting. When everything needs to have meaning, chance ceases to be accepted as a natural part of reality. And the real world is, to a large extent, unpredictable. Trying to eliminate randomness generates a simplified version of the world, more comfortable but less faithful. The most curious thing is that, from an internal point of view, none of this seems problematic. The narratives work. They provide purpose, organize emotions, and help us move forward. The brain fulfills its role of protecting, even if it needs to distort things to do so. The problem isn't the mechanism itself, but the lack of awareness about it. Without realizing how these patterns are created, a person ends up living within stories that seem too real to be questioned. Recognizing this process doesn't mean abandoning meaning, but understanding where it comes from. It means realizing that not everything that seems meaningful is true, and that not every coincidence carries a hidden message. This awareness changes how we interpret experiences, decisions, and even who we believe ourselves to be. It opens the way for a more honest relationship with reality, even when it is uncertain. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why non-existent patterns seem so real takes us directly to the core of how the brain validates these narratives, how it strengthens them over time, and why they become so difficult to deconstruct. It is at this point in the journey that we begin to see more clearly the boundary between perception and reality, and how this boundary is much more fragile than we usually imagine. Comment below, this makes sense to me. When this pattern recognition mechanism intensifies, it begins to manifest itself in even more curious, and extremely common, ways. That's where phenomena like pareidolia, superstition, and false connections that we make every day without realizing it come in. Suddenly, a face clearly appears in the drawing of an electrical outlet, in a cloud in the sky, or on the front of a car. 2 dots and a line are enough for the brain to state with conviction, that's a face. There is no doubt, no hesitation. The image imposes itself forcefully as if it had always been there. This happens because the human brain has an absolute priority, recognizing faces. From the first months of life, it is trained for this. Faces signify intention, emotion, threat, or protection. So, when there is any minimal combination of elements that resembles a face, the brain doesn't think twice. It fills in the rest. It doesn't matter if the object is inanimate or completely random. The sensation of recognition comes before any rational analysis. And once again, the brain doesn't ask if it's true. It asks if it makes sense. The same principle extends beyond images. It pervades how we interpret events. Many people report perceiving signs from the universe at decisive moments in life. A song playing at the right time. A random phrase that seems to answer an inner question perfectly. An unexpected encounter that takes on the contours of destiny. These events, in isolation, are perfectly explainable by chance. But when emotion and expectation enter the scene, the brain weaves everything into a powerful narrative. Expectation acts as a filter. When you expect something, even unconsciously, the brain begins to select information that confirms that expectation. It ignores what doesn't fit and amplifies what seems relevant. If you believe that certain numbers are special, you will notice those numbers much more frequently. Not because they appear more often, but because the brain has begun to highlight them. Reality hasn't changed, attention has. And where attention goes, meaning follows closely behind. This is how amulets, lucky numbers, and personal omens arise. An object that was present at an important moment comes to be seen as protective. A number associated with a victory gains special status. A specific sequence begins to be interpreted as a warning or confirmation. The brain creates an emotional link between the event and the symbol, and this link strengthens over time. Each new coincidence acts as reinforcement. Each absence of coincidence is discarded. The pattern sustains itself. Emotion is a powerful fuel in this process. The more intense the emotion associated with an experience, the more likely the brain is to seek meaning in it. In moments of fear, hope, love, or uncertainty, the mind becomes even more sensitive to patterns. It enters a state of heightened vigilance, searching for any signal that helps guide decisions. The impact of this is profound, because these interpretations begin to guide real behaviors, concrete choices, and life paths. The problem isn't in perceiving meaning. The problem lies in not realizing when that meaning is an internal construct. When emotion and expectation combine, the brain becomes an extremely creative storyteller. It creates coherent, engaging, meaningful stories. Stories that seem to explain everything. And the more these stories are repeated internally, the more real they become. They cease to be hypotheses and become personal truths. This is one of the most delicate aspects of the human experience. The line between interpretation and belief is thin. A false connection, when emotionally reinforced, can shape mindset, influence important decisions, and direct an entire journey. Not because it's true, but because it's convincing. The brain values emotional coherence over factual accuracy. And this makes sense from a survival standpoint, but not always from a reality standpoint. Over time, these beliefs become integrated into one's identity. The person comes to define themselves by them. Questioning them seems threatening, almost like losing an internal foothold. This is why superstitions and personal signs are so resistant to logic. They don't exist to explain the world objectively, they exist to offer subjective security. And as long as they fulfill this role, the brain will continue to strongly defend these narratives. Recognizing this process doesn't mean ridiculing those who believe in signs or symbols. On the contrary, it means understanding something fundamental about the human mind. We all do this to a greater or lesser degree. We all create connections that go beyond the facts. The difference lies in the level of awareness we have about this process. When we don't perceive how emotion and expectation shape what we see, we end up living within interpretations that seem inevitable. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how these false connections are formed opens the door to something transformative. Realizing how the brain validates these beliefs, how it protects them from questioning, and how, little by little, they begin to influence not only what we interpret but also how we react to the world. It is at this point in the journey that the most impactful revelations begin about how the mind sustains patterns that seem too real to be mere coincidence. Comment below, this makes sense to me. There's a point where all of this intensifies in an almost invisible, yet profoundly impactful way, when anxiety and uncertainty enter the scene. In states of heightened stress, the brain not only continues searching for patterns, it accelerates this process. It's as if the detection system is adjusted to maximum sensitivity mode. Small signals begin to seem large. Coincidences gain excessive weight. The mind starts forcing connections not because they are solid, but because the uncertainty becomes unbearable. Anxiety creates a specific emotional backdrop. It puts the brain in a state of constant vigilance. Everything seems potentially relevant. Everything could be a threat or a clue. In this state, the brain tries to predict the unpredictable at all costs. It prefers to create scenarios, hypotheses, and narratives rather than remain in the void of "I don't know." The absence of clear answers generates physical and mental discomfort, and the brain does what it has always done throughout evolution. It tries to anticipate what lies ahead. When we are anxious, the mind begins to operate like a hypersensitive radar. It picks up noise and transforms it into signals. It observes patterns where before there was nothing special. This doesn't happen because the person is imagining things, but because the brain understands that uncertainty represents risk. And risk, for the mind, demands action. Even if that action is only creating an internal explanation that brings some sense of control. The curious thing is that, in this state, the brain doesn't realize it's exaggerating. On the contrary, everything seems extremely logical. Anxiety gives a false sense of cognitive urgency. The mind believes it needs to understand everything now, that it needs to decipher what's happening, that it needs to make quick decisions. And to do that, it starts connecting the dots in an increasingly aggressive way. The pattern doesn't emerge smoothly, it imposes itself. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of the relationship between emotion and perception. The higher the stress level, the lower the tolerance for chance. The brain begins to reject any explanation involving randomness. It wants causes, motives, intentions. It wants to transform chaos into something predictable. Even if this predictability is illusory, it offers temporary relief. The mind calms down by believing that it understands what is happening. This is how, in moments of great uncertainty, people begin to see signs in everything. A random phrase seems like a confirmation. An unexpected event becomes a warning. A banal repetition gains the status of a message. The brain becomes an exaggerated pattern detector. It amplifies everything that can be interpreted as meaning and ignores what doesn't fit. Attention becomes selective. Reality passes through a powerful emotional filter. This mechanism has a direct impact on mindset. Under stress, the way we interpret the world changes. We become more reactive, less critical, and more likely to accept explanations that bring immediate comfort. Important decisions can be made based on distorted readings of reality. Not because of a lack of intelligence, but because the brain is prioritizing emotional survival, not accuracy. Anxiety also shortens the time between perception and interpretation. There is no room for pause, for doubt, for questioning. The brain jumps straight to conclusions. And the more these conclusions seem to alleviate internal discomfort, the more they are reinforced. The mind quickly learns that creating meaning reduces anxiety, even if that meaning is not true. This learning becomes consolidated and begins to operate automatically. Over time, this pattern can become chronic. The person begins to live in a constant state of searching for hidden signs, confirmations, and explanations. The world becomes a field of incessant interpretations. Every detail seems to carry a greater meaning. This can be exhausting but also addictive. There is a feeling of always deciphering something, always one step ahead, always attentive to the behind-the-scenes aspects of reality. The problem is that this state robs us of something essential, the ability to accept the unknown. Uncertainty, which is part of the human experience, comes to be seen as an enemy. And the more the brain tries to eliminate it, the more patterns it creates. It's a silent cycle. Anxiety generates patterns. Patterns reinforce the feeling of control. Control reduces anxiety for a moment. But since reality remains unpredictable, the process begins again. Recognizing this process is profoundly transformative. Not because it eliminates anxiety, but because it changes the relationship with it. Realizing that the brain exaggerates patterns in moments of stress helps create a small space between what we feel and what we interpret. This space is where awareness begins to emerge. It is there that more balanced decisions can be born. It is there that the person begins to question whether what seems so clear is, in fact, so real. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of anxiety in creating patterns leads us to an even more delicate point. Understanding why certain ideas, beliefs, and interpretations become so difficult to abandon, even when they no longer make rational sense. It is at this point in the journey that we begin to see how the brain protects its own narratives and how this silently shapes the way we deal with reality, with decisions, and with the very uncertainty of life. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. There's a very specific reason why all of this seems so convincing. It's not just because the brain creates patterns, nor is it simply because anxiety amplifies this process. It's because when a pattern is formed, something powerful happens internally, a genuine feeling of understanding arises. It's not an abstract idea. It's a concrete emotional experience. It's as if a gear clicks into place, as if a mental fog dissipates for an instant. And the brain interprets this feeling as proof that it has arrived at the truth. That feeling of "now I understand" is deeply seductive. It comes with emotional relief. Tension decreases, restlessness subsides, the discomfort of uncertainty loses its power. The brain registers this state as positive, almost rewarding. From an internal point of view, it seems that something has been resolved. And when something seems resolved, we rarely feel the need to question it. The mind understands that it has fulfilled its main mission, to restore balance. The problem is that this feeling isn't necessarily linked to objective reality. It's linked to internal coherence. The brain doesn't measure truth, it measures emotional consistency. If the pieces fit together comfortably, if the narrative seems logical within the story that already exists in the mind, that's enough. The feeling of understanding doesn't require external proof. It validates itself. This is where the trap elegantly closes. The pattern generates relief. Relief generates confidence. Confidence generates attachment to the narrative. And the more a person trusts that interpretation, the less room there is for doubt. The feeling of control comes into play. It seems that now it's possible to predict, anticipate, understand what was previously confusing. And control, even when illusory, is extremely attractive to the human brain. This illusion of control is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of this process. When we believe we've identified a pattern, we feel we're one step ahead of the chaos. That we're no longer victims of chance. That there's a logic behind events. This feeling changes the mindset. The person starts acting like someone who knows, not like someone exploring possibilities. And this has a direct impact on decisions. Decisions made under a feeling of understanding tend to be quick and confident. The brain interprets emotional relief as a green light. Little room is given to revision, critical analysis, or consideration of alternatives. After all, if it makes so much sense, why doubt it? The internal narrative gains authority. It begins to guide choices, behaviors, and even judgments about other people and situations. The most delicate aspect is that all of this happens without the person realizing they are being deceived by their own sense of clarity. There is no internal warning saying, "Be careful, this may not be true." The brain confuses understanding with reality. And this confusion is incredibly common. Feeling that something makes sense is not the same as it being true. But, in subjective experience, this difference almost disappears. Over time, this dynamic strengthens. Every time the narrative seems to work, it is reinforced. Every event that seems to confirm it is remembered. Every event that contradicts it is minimized or reinterpreted. The brain protects the pattern because it is associated with emotional relief. Questioning the pattern means giving up that relief and facing uncertainty again. And the human mind, as we have seen, deeply resists this. This is one of the reasons why beliefs based on false connections are so resilient. No matter how much external data appears, the internal narrative continues to seem more true because it is emotionally effective. It organizes the experience, gives direction, creates meaning. The brain is not interested in dismantling it, it is interested in preserving it. This is the silent impact of this mechanism on the individual journey. There's also an identity component to all of this. When an interpretation is repeated long enough, it becomes part of how a person sees themselves. Questioning the pattern ceases to be merely revising an idea. It becomes about touching on something personal. The narrative doesn't just explain the world, it explains who the person is within it. And that makes letting go even more difficult. This feeling of understanding creates a kind of premature closure. The mind believes it has already reached a conclusion and ends the search. Curiosity diminishes. Openness decreases. The brain settles into what seems resolved. But the real world is rarely as simple as the stories we tell ourselves. Reality is ambiguous, complex, full of invisible variables. And it is precisely this complexity that the brain tries to smooth out by creating convincing patterns. The paradox is that this mechanism, which is so helpful in moving forward, can also limit transformation. When everything seems to make sense too soon, exploration stops. When understanding comes too quickly, the investigation ends. And many deeper truths require exactly the opposite: time, doubt, discomfort, and a willingness to remain in the I don't know state. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why this feeling of understanding is so compelling leads us to an essential point in the journey: perceiving how the brain sustains these narratives over time and how it reacts when something threatens to break this sense of control. It is in this delicate space between emotional relief and truth that the most transformative revelations about how we think, decide, and interpret reality begin to emerge. Comment below: this makes sense to me. There's a delicate point in this journey where what began as a protective mechanism starts to generate side effects. Seeing patterns in itself isn't the problem. The problem arises when these patterns crystallize, when they cease to be flexible interpretations and become rigid beliefs. At that point, the brain is no longer just organizing the chaos, it's defending a narrative. And the more this narrative seems to offer security, the harder it becomes to question it. Rigid beliefs are born precisely from this process. A pattern initially perceived as a possibility comes to be treated as a certainty. The mind stops considering alternatives because they threaten the emotional relief achieved. Questioning the belief would mean giving up that feeling of understanding that brought stability at some point. So the brain does what it knows best: it protects. It filters information, reinforces confirmations, minimizes contradictions. Not out of malice but for emotional survival. This is how some interpretations gain disproportionate power. Coincidences begin to be seen as proof. Isolated events are connected by invisible threads that only make sense within that specific narrative. Gradually, the person is no longer just interpreting the world, they are living within an internal story that explains everything. And when everything seems explained, doubt becomes uncomfortable, almost unwanted. In this environment, conspiracy theories find fertile ground. They offer something the brain loves: a complete narrative with clear cause, intention, and those responsible. Nothing is random. Nothing is by chance. Everything is connected. For a mind that suffers from uncertainty, this is extremely seductive. The complexity of the world is reduced to a comprehensible plot. The feeling of control returns. And once again, objective truth becomes secondary to emotional comfort. The most important thing to understand here is that this has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence or rationality. Many highly intelligent people fall into this kind of mental trap. What's at stake is not cognitive ability but emotional need. In contexts of fear, instability, or a feeling of loss of control, the brain seeks any structure that offers meaning. If that structure comes in the form of a conspiratorial explanation, it will be readily accepted. Decisions based on coincidences follow the same logic. When illusory patterns begin to guide real choices, the impact becomes concrete. Someone decides not to follow a path because something went wrong before. Another believes that certain signs indicate the right or wrong time to act. Coincidence becomes a decision criterion. And since these decisions are made with emotional conviction, they are rarely questioned afterward. Something works out, the pattern is reinforced. If it goes wrong, the narrative adjusts to continue making sense. This is one of the most subtle workings of the human mind: the ability to adapt to keep a story alive. The brain doesn't like to admit it was wrong. Not because it's proud, but because admitting error threatens the sense of security it has built up. So it adjusts details, reinterprets facts, reorganizes memories. All to preserve internal coherence. The narrative remains intact, even if external reality contradicts it. Over time, this can lead to an impoverishment of experience. The person begins to see the world in an increasingly narrow way. Everything needs to fit into the same pattern. The new is viewed with suspicion. The unexpected is rejected. Transformation becomes limited because transformation requires openness to the unknown. And the unknown, as we have seen, is exactly what the brain tries to avoid. It's important to state this clearly and carefully: the brain doesn't lie. It doesn't create patterns to deceive. It creates patterns to protect. To protect from uncertainty, fear, and explanatory voids. This mechanism was essential for our survival and continues to be useful in many contexts. The problem isn't the mechanism itself, but the lack of awareness about when it begins to lead us towards overly rigid interpretations. When this awareness arises, something interesting happens. It's not that the patterns disappear. They continue to emerge because they are part of the normal functioning of the mind. But the relationship with them changes. Instead of absolute truths, they are seen as hypotheses. Instead of certainties, they become possibilities. This creates space. Space for doubt, for revision, for choices more aligned with reality and less guided by fear. This shift in mindset is profoundly transformative. It doesn't eliminate anxiety or the desire for meaning, but it creates a healthier balance between interpretation and fact. The person begins to realize when they are forcing connections, when they are trying to control the unpredictable. And this awareness alone reduces the power these patterns have over important decisions. There is a subtle but crucial difference between finding meaning and clinging to it. The former is natural. The latter can become limiting. When we manage to observe this limit, something opens up. Reality becomes a space for exploration again, not just confirmation. The brain continues trying to protect, but now it finds an ally: consciousness. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding when pattern recognition becomes a problem leads us directly to a central question in this journey: how to develop a more conscious relationship with what the brain creates automatically without fighting against it, but without being blindly driven by its narratives. It is at this point that the more subtle reflections on mental freedom, choice, and how we deal with chance in everyday life begin. Comment below: this makes sense to me. There is an understanding that completely changes how everything fits together. A simple yet profound insight that often goes unnoticed because it challenges a very comfortable idea we have about ourselves. The human brain wasn't made to see reality as it is. It was made to make it bearable. This phrase, when truly assimilated, shifts the perspective. It removes the mind from the center of absolute truth and places it in the realm of functionality, adaptation, and emotional survival. Raw reality is chaotic, ambiguous, and indifferent. There are no guarantees, no clear scripts, no ready-made explanations for everything. If the brain had to deal with this all the time, without filters, without shortcuts, without narratives, the emotional cost would be extremely high. So it does what it has always done throughout our evolutionary journey. It organizes, simplifies, and creates meaning. Not because this is faithful to reality, but because it allows us to continue living, deciding, and moving forward. When we understand this, something interesting happens. We begin to realize that many of the patterns we see are not external signs waiting to be deciphered, but internal constructs trying to give shape to the world. The brain creates maps, not photographs. It offers useful versions of reality, not exact portraits. And this in itself is not a problem. The problem arises when we confuse the map with the territory. Throughout the day, how many patterns do you create without realizing it? How many connections arise automatically, without you stopping to question whether they are real or merely convenient? One thought leads to another, an event seems to confirm an old belief, a coincidence reinforces an existing narrative. All of this happens so naturally that it is rarely noticed. The brain does its work behind the scenes, silently, keeping the experience organized and emotionally acceptable. In many instances, this helps. It helps to get through difficult phases, to cope with losses, to make quick decisions when there isn't time to analyze everything in depth. It helps to continue life when uncertainty would be paralyzing. In this sense, the patterns created by the brain are allies. They offer temporary stability, direction, and even hope. They are tools for adaptation. But at other times, these same patterns get in the way. They can limit choices, distort interpretations, and perpetuate beliefs that no longer serve us. They can lead to important decisions being made based on coincidences, feelings, or internal narratives that seem solid but don't withstand closer scrutiny. They can close doors before they are even explored, simply because they don't fit the established pattern. The real insight isn't in trying to eliminate this functioning. That would be impossible and, honestly, undesirable. The turning point lies in developing awareness of it. In perceiving when the brain is helping and when it's just trying to alleviate momentary discomfort. In recognizing that feeling clarity isn't the same as accessing the truth. That emotional relief isn't synonymous with deep understanding. This awareness creates a very valuable inner space. A space between what arises automatically and what is accepted as truth. In this space, curiosity can exist without haste. Doubt ceases to be an enemy and becomes part of the journey. Reality doesn't need to be fully explained to be experienced. Chance ceases to be a constant threat and becomes recognized as an inevitable part of the human experience. When we look at our own patterns with this level of attention, something transforms. They lose some of their absolute power. They continue to emerge, but they no longer control everything alone. They become observed, not just followed. This changes the mindset. It changes how decisions are made. It changes the relationship with uncertainty. The person stops fighting so hard to control the unpredictable and begins to live better with it. This change is neither dramatic nor immediate. It happens gradually in the details. In noticing when an interpretation seems too comfortable. In recognizing when a narrative emerges too quickly. In gently questioning whether what makes so much sense now will still make sense tomorrow. This type of observation doesn't weaken the mind, it strengthens it. Because it brings flexibility, and flexibility is one of the greatest cognitive strengths that exist. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to observe our own patterns, we inevitably arrive at an even more interesting question. If the brain creates versions of reality to make it bearable, what happens when we learn to live a little better with discomfort, doubt, and chance? It is at this point that the relationship between perception, consciousness, and mental freedom begins to reveal itself more clearly, opening space for an even deeper understanding of how we construct meaning and who we are within this process. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation truly resonated with you. Perhaps an idea kept echoing, perhaps you recognized yourself in some patterns, perhaps you simply felt it made sense to keep listening. If that's the case, subscribe to the channel. Not as an automatic gesture but as a way of saying that this type of content, deeper, more reflective, more honest about the human mind, is worth continuing to be part of your routine. If you'd like, you can also leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple like, I'm with you until the end, or, this message was for me. Sometimes, putting it into words helps to close the loop on what was heard, and creates a real connection between those on this side and those on the other. And if at any point during the video you felt that silent sense of understanding, that connection that needs no explanation, a like here is just a way to mark that. Not out of obligation but because this exchange keeps this space alive and allows more conversations like this to continue happening. If you'd like to continue exploring this topic, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this idea. Click on it and continue with me there. The journey doesn't end here, it just changes layers.